This is the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Lowell. I'm joined by my co-host, Sherry Stewart.
Hi, I'm Sherry, and we're joined by V and Haley.
Hello.
V and Haley are the two halves of Storybrewers Roleplaying, creators of Alas for the Awful Sea and Good Society.
Yeah.
For our Hangouts Roundup, we're going to talk about games that we played on the Hangouts. And then V and Haley are going to talk about projects that they're working on right now. And then we're going to do Giving Me Life. But we're going to start out with the gaming discussion. Sherry, how was your March? What did you play? What did you dig?
Okay, March has been pretty awesome for me. I've played Bat Hack some more. We've been play testing on that. Got to play some more Hearts of Wulin with Agatha. My heart. Urban Shadows, which continues to amaze me for how fun that is. Trail of Cthulhu, which we're playing classic, investigative, and dark, and it has been a lot of fun and thoughtful. 13th Age, it's my flavor of crunchy. And of course our homebrew. And then on the Gauntlet, it's been Tomb of the Serpent Kings and Tales from the Loop.
And what do you want to talk about today?
I think I'm going to talk about Tomb of the Serpent Kings, which is a module, an OSR module that was written by Skirples with art by Scrap Princess. And it kind of comes out of that G plus OSR community. And it's being run by Mark Causey with Black Hack. And it's a neat little dungeon crawl with encounters that sort of slowly build up this picture of a cult of Snake Man assassins and how they were ruined by a leader who was just awful. It's been a long time since I've played a straight dungeon crawl in a lot of ways, and I kind of forget how much room just in the pace and the mode of OSR that there is to just breathe and kind of the characters, who are just two stats and a name and a class, kind of build themselves organically in those moments. And that is a pleasure to watch, particularly when you have awesome fellow players. And I've been very lucky to get to play with Stephen Carnes, who's been a delight the whole way through. And also played with Sean and Matthew and Horst. Each one of those for a different session. So it had some constant time with Stephen and drop-in players. It worked out really well. Mark is lovely. The game itself, of course, has no safety tools built in, but Mark really brings it to the table. He's good for breaks every time you start thinking that maybe you could use one, because it can be kind of a brain burner. There's one. And he's considerate and he checks in all the time, and he's really lovely. And I'm actually surprised. I really like Black Hack.
Wow.
It is a very elegant, light system with some smart mechanics. Oh, and the energy of the art that Scrap Princess did is always one of my favorite things.
What are you playing? I have to ask that.
Oh, I chose to play Crusader. I have a couple of prayers, and they're both carved into my skin, and kind of brutal and grim and all of those things.
Okay.
So, yes. Of course, you have to have one of those people in the game in order to, keep everyone from dying.
So, you liked a lot about it, but are there some things that you weren't as sure about?
The one thing about a dungeon call is you're just kind of going back between that whole thing of, is it lethal? Am I going to get killed? And, do we need to do this in order to move on? And so there's a weird thing of when you're with a new group, that you're trying to figure out if when they're taking a hesitation, if they don't want to do it, or if they're just doing turn taking and trying to let someone else do something. And it's, if anything, that's kind of the one thing that I find myself leaning towards and going, should I say something? Shouldn't I? Should I do a thing? Shouldn't I? So that's probably more the most social, like, what's going on here. And then the other thing is you play long enough and you get a certain amount of puzzle fatigue where someone says something and sticks in your head the wrong way. And you're like going, I think this is like an elevator. It's nothing like an elevator. And, you just seem like a doofus. But other than that, it's enjoyable. And I guess my little sadness is we may not make it all the way through the module in the 4 sessions. So I don't know if I'll get to find the whole story that's going on. But
do you feel like you're getting a good picture of what's going on from the events?
It's actually pretty flavorful. And I would say a good chunk of that is in the module. But Mark also also makes sure to bring parts in and underscore those and underline them so that we don't miss those pieces. He's been really good about that, and I've really appreciated that.
V, Haley, comments, questions for Sherry?
Yeah, I'm curious about these Snake Man assassins.
Oh, yeah.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how scary are them?
It's very odd because they're like, this big place is right next to this little town. And 10 years ago, they used to be like a real threat. And yet no one's like, oh no, the Snake Man assassins or anything that we get any sense of. So in some ways, it's like an artifact that just happens to be there. So, but when you're in there, they're pretty nasty in that sense of like what was important to them. And then we're only seeing like the aftermath of them being destroyed, and the person who destroyed them is truly awful. So let's say that he's 80% more awful. They were terrible then, even then.
So these are martyred Snake Man assassins.
Yeah, like you kind of feel sorry for them.
Oh. Look, the one thing I was going to add to that is that Australia seems like very much a country of snake assassins ourselves. So I feel like I would have less pity on them.
That could be
fair
it.
enough.
You're toughened up more than me.
Haley, any thoughts, questions?
Are you playing the first edition of Black Hat or the second edition?
I'm pretty sure it's the second edition. It is very slick looking, and the PDF was right up there, so I am almost certain it's... In fact, I know it's the second edition. Quick to grasp and easy to use, and it has this little thing where you can use your armor to like save yourself from a fatal blow, which means that your OSR is about 200% less deadly than it would be otherwise.
I love that.
I've never played that. I played a little bit of White Hack like once, and I think I died horribly. I don't remember exactly.
Usually you do.
Anything else you want to say about that, Sherry?
No, just that I hadn't played like that for so long that I'm like, I have to do it again and see if the good parts are the good parts I remember and the bad parts are the bad parts. I haven't had any bad. I mean, that's literally it. So a lot of the gaming culture is just so good and positive, and the players are super engaged. So you're just not having the worst parts of what I think of not the OSR, because that would be incorrect. I would just say of my experiences in gaming and this sort of thing in the old days. So just...
And we are old enough that the old days are pretty old.
They're very old.
Awesome. So, V, tell us about your gaming in March.
Hello, I'm V. March was a busy month for me, so we did a lot of playtesting. It's always a given that I've played a lot of Good Society. I ran Practical Magic's expansion for it, which was really fun. We also played the LARP online and in person, and as well as playtesting our upcoming sports anime RPG, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And then on Gauntlet, so I playtested Ari Ramsey's game Lost Roads.
Oh, wow.
Which is about climate change in a bygone age. That was really cool, little thing. And also, Hearts and Will In. I was also in the same game with Agatha. And lastly, the game I'm talking about today is Rider's Last Rites by Sydney Icarus. That was a really, really intense experience, but pretty awesome.
Yeah, so tell us about what that is. It's not something that I've actually heard of before. I know it's been mentioned in the Gauntlet, but I'm not aware of what it is.
Yeah. So first things first for that game, I will put a little content warning here that the game is about sort of like end of life and palliative decision making, as well as wars and those who fight in them. So that is the subject matter of the game. So Rider's Last Rites. That game is written and designed by Sydney Icarus, who you can find on Twitter at Action Economy, with art and layout by JL Householder. Rider's Last Rites is a one-shot game that was written for the Sad Mech Jam 2019. I think that was, was that itch.io? I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, I'm not really into the game jam scene yet, but it was really interesting to see that from the periphery. And I wanted to talk about it because it is such a good example of how to design like a well-realized, powerful game in a small form factor, and to get that density of material, experience, and like just what a game is about in that short period of time. So what the game is, it's this freeform type RPG. I think you could play it just totally in character, but we played it where more traditional RPG style, where you could talk in third person, flash forward, chain scene, etc. And it's about the death of a soldier and what to do with what she leaves behind. Specifically, it's the scenario is the soldier that just passed, Felix Ryder. She's a mech pilot, and her mech, Valiant Fox, he is what's left behind. And it's like a 7,000-pound mech, right? So you got to think about what you're going to do with that much material, given that Valiant Fox can't operate anymore without Felix, the pilot that's bonded to him. So it's like really, really interesting. And the game is for exactly 4 players, and each of you are playing 4 characters who are the most important people in Felix's life. You're not all necessarily close to each other, but you are all close to Felix. You know, at the start of the game, you pick from the wingman character, who's another pilot, the oldest friend who's been with them through this whole time, who's like a technician kind of person, the lover, the medical doctor, and Felix's commanding officer. The special thing about the commanding officer is that they will need to make the call at the end of the game about what to do, like to write it. So this is the really cool thing about the game. At the end of the game, you get an order, and the commanding officer has to fill out that whole legal document form thing and sign their name. And that's it. You're committed to that course of action.
Oof.
So yeah, so that's the game. It's a bit long, but it's really cool. There was a couple of things I really liked about it. Was the phase structure. So the first half of the game, you're all sitting around, remembering, telling stories about Felix and that sort of thing. And then very naturally you move on to the second phase, which is when there are no more tales to tell, when there is that silence, this commanding officer has to take the lead and open the floor up to the real discussion of, hey, what do we do now? What do we do? What should I do with Valiant Fox? And that's the second part of the game. You start deciding on what should be done. But it's very blurry between those two things. And I really like that it's both very clear in its phasic structure, but has that blurriness and awkwardness that real life would bring into that situation. Yeah, that was really cool.
I guess one question I would have is it, I've seen some of the sad Mech Jam games that have had very much a touchstone of a specific series or a specific kind of mecha game. Does this feel more open, or does it actually lean into a particular touchstone in terms of art and tone?
I would say it is actually, it doesn't actually lean into as many touchstones as you would think, because I think the intentionality there is to leave like sort of a space for players to bring in their own vision of what that feature is. I think the game only presents to you the very basic situation. There's mechs, there's pilot, there's some sort of bond, but it's not really told to you what that is or what that looks like. There is a war going on, but it's not told to you who it's with, what your situation is, except that it seems desperate. So there's a lot of spaces where you can fill that in yourself. And I think that lends itself to having a different experience whenever you do. That's more reflective of what players want to bring into that story. Like in our game that we played, the mechs themselves were like really sentient almost. And one of the players after the game was like, "Oh, Sid, this is so cool that you made these sentient mechs." And Sid said, "No, I didn't. You did that." So that's cool. I liked seeing that given just enough to go off, but letting players dictate what that really looks like in their game.
And I saw in the show notes that this is based on another game?
Yeah, so the game that this draws on is Heroic Measures, which is a 2018 entry into the Golden Cobra Challenge. That game's by Daniel Elson and Zam Zetlin. It's similar because it's the same end-of-life decision-making process, but it's a fantasy world, and Krondar, I think, is still in the process of passing on rather than having passed on. But the very big difference between the two is that Heroic Measures has a GM who is like a clinical practitioner who takes the players through this process, I guess. And the players themselves are told to make their own characters, and they're told to make those characters roughly equal so that there is no servant and there is no commanding officer kind of thing. That's very different from Riders, which you are given set characters with set perspectives, and you are also mired in like a hierarchy that's like a military hierarchy already. It's very loose because it doesn't say that this is higher than that, that's higher than this, but commanding officer, that gives you something. The fact that they're a medical person, medical doctor, gives you sort of an implied hierarchical structure that you can bring into it. It's very different feeling. There's also not a GM, so you're kind of just a group of people who are trying to like muddle their way through it. And it has that much more raw experience of, well, I'm feeling a lot of things and I don't really know what I want, let alone what you want, let alone how this should go. And I think that really makes the experience very different to Heroic Measures, even though they're about the same sort of thing.
That's really interesting.
Yes. Sorry, Haley didn't play this game.
Oh.
Because it is in Haley's, like, X-card territory of space. And that.
I was thinking, I can't imagine getting through the first 5 minutes without being blubbering a lot. It's just the whole thing. I mean, oh my God, a mech that is, yeah.
So you mentioned that you played it as more of a traditional tabletop version, but it could be played as a LARP as well. Do you think those two experiences would create a different impact?
I would 100% say they would, because especially in the way we played it, you couldn't have done that in a LARPy like context, because we had to. I almost think that it's better doing it that way, because in what we did when we were playing the game, we brought in a lot of different time periods through flashbacks that was explained to everyone in the group, so you get that context. You also get like scenes where you can introspect outwardly for people to see. In that way, it's very different. You can actually get a breadth of stories out there rather than like the LARP experience, which would mostly be, I think, internal, or it's much harder to get that sort of exposition in a LARP context. Yeah, I think there would be very different experiences, but I could see the LARP the being much more emotional because it's bottling your world up as well inside you. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I answered that clearly.
Yeah, no.
No, it makes complete sense.
It's interesting to me that we're seeing games, both RPGs and a couple of board games this last year, that are dealing with end-of-life questions and flashing back on those things. It feels like a tough area to work in.
Yes.
So our particular format requires that I ask you, is there anything you didn't like or had less of a certainty about?
Right. Well, there's probably the thing that I was thinking about last night when I was trying to pick apart this game was, so when we played, Sid was there as just sort of like a facilitator, didn't play, and they ran our debrief. Imagine if you were playing with just 4 people. It'll be really extremely hard to debrief after that experience without like a facilitator who wasn't involved in that decision-making process, who wasn't involved in the situation. And I actually remember when I was playing this, that debrief was actually almost the most difficult part for it, for me. So I think that having an external facilitator or someone to run the debrief is actually would have been a good thing to put in the text. Yeah, and also it's not that replayable, and I'm only like grumpy about that because I'd love to play a game again. I guess it would be different though. Every time you play it, it would be different.
I get what you're saying about the facilitator. We played Before the Storm a few times, and that is GM-less, and each time the debrief felt odd, like we did need somebody to moderate it, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, anything else you want to say about this?
I'd just say my takeaways from the game that was also like expressly mentioned in the text of the game is the importance of advanced healthcare directives. They are living wills. They're the legal document where you can specify what actions that you want to be followed and taken in respect of you when you can no longer make that decision. So that was that is a very strong takeaway to have from the game. And then this one quote I want to leave you with that I really, really like. It's, "The spaces between are as important for remembering, writer, as the stories you tell." And I think that's just very, very cool.
Nice. Sherry, any questions, comments?
I do have a question. When I am with people who are grieving, I find that one of the ways they speak about the thing that they feel bad about is they tell stories sort of in the chronology of not time, but emotion. Did you get to see some of that? That is one of those.
Yeah, 100%. There are like loose question prompts in the game text, but we almost didn't need them because we just followed the emotion. None of it was chronological. It would be whatever was relevant from the whole span of your character's existence was open game, and we just jumped around. So I think this game was good in that way. It really mimics how you would approach that sort of conversation as humans.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely.
Haley, anything else you'd like to add? Comments, questions?
Sounds super interesting. I love the two-part phase structure. The fact that you spend that time building up your investment in that person, and then after that, that's the moment where you have to decide how you're going to deal with it, rather than jumping straight into that decision without having that context.
Yeah.
Very clever.
It's very clever in that way.
Thank you, V.
Pleasure.
Haley, why don't you tell us about your March gaming?
Yeah, so very similar to V. My March gaming was a lot of was of course Hearts of Wulin, Good Society LARP twice, another version of Good Society, and our sports anime game twice. And I also played The King is Dead, which is the one that I'm going to talk about, and that was very interesting.
I'm really excited. I haven't heard anything about this except people saying that they loved it, so I'm very curious.
Yeah, it's a super interesting game, and I really recommend that you give it a go if you haven't, because you can play it in a single session in the space of a few hours, although my opinion was that despite what the game text says, actually, it could be quite fun over a few sessions where you get to dive a bit more deeply into that story. So The King is Dead is by Vincent and Maggie Baker, and it sort of bills itself as a Game of Thrones reimagined as an RPG party game. And as you can imagine in a Game of Thrones type game, is that you play a person from a house fighting for the throne. You sort of fight with other houses, but you can also fight within your house. You can have multiple characters from the same house, and it's very Games of Thronesy feel in that respect. And I got to play with the Azpac crew, which is always lovely. I played the nephew of the current incumbent, who is the infant heir to the throne. That was very enjoyable. It is actually divided into mini games, and each of these mini games has their own distinct structure. So that means that you can walk into the game with no idea how to play and just play. I was looking at the game because I was running it, and I was like, oh, I need to learn the rules. And then I looked at it and I was like, oh, I don't, actually. You just start at the beginning and you keep going. So that's really cool. And each game has its own distinct feel and unique evocative prompts which emulate a particular kind of scene you might see in Game of Thrones. So, for example, a conversation over food, or stealing time together, or meeting a sword to sword. I loved meeting sword to sword. It's a really interesting way of playing out combat as well, through narrative prompts as opposed to through rolling dice or through, some aspect that determines whether you win or lose. It just determines what happens in the combat. And the game is extremely cooperative. So as I sort of mentioned, down to even whether you win or lose a fight, it's something that you as a group decide together.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you go through the game taking turns, and in your turn you have the opportunity to pick one of these games and sort of see how it plays out.
I've got a bit of question about that, like meeting sword to sword.
Mm.
So whether you win or lose a fight is always meeting sword to sword, or is it a different?
Yes, a sword fight is meeting sword to sword.
Okay.
There's also war, but that's different.
Yeah, Can you explain that a bit more closely for me? Just because I don't know how the minigame works at all.
The way it works is that you take turns to ask each other questions. Those questions are prompts from the book. You can either read them out word for word or ad-lib a little, but there's stuff like, I step forward to lunge at you, but I go too far. Do you take advantage, or do you take the opportunity to dart away?
Ah, cool.
And then the other person describes what they do, and then they take turns to ask you a question. And eventually you get to the point where you start asking closing questions. So you might ask, I have my knife to your throat. Do you submit, or do you allow yourself to get cut, for example? And those kind of questions end the fight. And I think that brings me on to something that is a really interesting aspect of this game, but that sort of sometimes works really well and sometimes doesn't work that well, which is that I think in an extremely cooperative game like this, it can be hard to balance being courageous with being respectful. Because you have to be courageous, you have to make things happen, and the game structure will kind of force you into that a little bit as well. But you also don't want to be the person who's like, okay, yeah, I win the fight, you know, like, is this okay? Is it okay if I win? Can I hurt your character? I don't know. There's no external arbitration for this. It's just kind of like what we decided to do. So in the fighting for Sword one, we sort of ended up in a little bit of a loop for a while where it was clear that no one wanted to be the person who's like, yeah, kill your character. They're dead. To the point where we ended up in a situation where like both characters were too wounded to keep fighting, and that was the only way we could resolve this combat.
It's interesting because I was going to ask you, having played Sword, Crown, and Unspeakable Power, where everyone is terrible and awful to one another. This sounds like it's the same thing, but the other end of the spectrum in terms of play.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the characters are awful to each other, but the players have the opportunity to be really nice because of how cooperative it is. So sometimes you end up in a weird loop because of that. I think it's quite funny.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess in Scup, because you roll dice, it tells you what happens. You feel absolved of the psychic.
I'm going to try to be awful. I'm going to roll the dice, and the dice may tell me I'm not going to kill you.
Right. So. Exactly. Oh, no, look, I'm afraid I do kill you. Great, let me describe that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you don't have that absolution of responsibility. You have to be like, yeah, now's the moment that I stab you. So that's a really interesting aspect of it.
Other things that you had questions about?
For me, a lot of the things that I really liked about this game are also things that I wasn't sure about. Because I think this game does go for a really particular style, and it's really an experience that's outside of what you normally get in an RPG. And it's not something that I'd want all the time, but it's great for a single trajectory of game, which I think is why it bills itself as the RPG party game. The storytelling is very fragmented. It's more like a sweeping pastiche of moments than one continuing narrative. And that makes it really intriguing. Like, you always want to be like, what's going to happen next? What happened between those things? Why is he here? What is he doing? Which you kind of get when you watch Game of Thrones as well. You're like, ooh, now he's with the woman in the place. But like, in Game of Thrones, somebody has a plan and somebody understands what's happening. Whereas in A King is Dead, nobody knows. You're just carrying on. And so that is it's a really interesting way of telling stories, but sometimes it's not very coherent. But it's fascinating in its own way. And the other thing is the system of choosing prompts, which is great because it gives each game this sort of really unique character and really keeps it in the theme. But the downside of that is it can create a bit of a stop-start method of play and can slow the game down a little bit because you're like, oh, what prompt do I want? Oh, there's 12 to choose from. Let me read them. Oh, I'm going to pick that one. And the other person's like, oh, you pick that one. Let me think about what I'm going to say in response to that one. And that sort of pattern repeats over and over again. So it does have it has a slower pace. I think that's just inherent in the game as well. And lastly, I think we played with 5, which was really too much for a single session. I would say 3 or 4 people is more than enough for one session. Okay. But like I said, I think I could play the same continuous game for 3 or 4 sessions and be pretty happy.
That's really interesting.
That is cool.
Sherry, questions, comments?
When you said that, the first thing I thought about were all of the list moves in PBTA games. They just...
Yeah.
You have to stop and go scroll. What are my 4 questions that I can choose from, and which one is strategically useful? And yeah, next thing you know, 5 minutes has gone by and you're still going,
Yeah, that's why there's no list of questions in Hearts of Oldham, because Sherry made me take those out. So.
Now the secrets are coming out. It's like it's like going into a restaurant and getting like one of those menus that's just got one thing on it, and you're like, I guess I'm having that. And when you're like 4 pages, 100 lists, how am I going to make a decision? Yeah, I was actually interested, Hayley. So you said that there are a lot of mini games in each turn is a mini game essentially.
Yep.
How many minigames do you think you go through in like the whole one shot?
Well, the minigames are really disparate in length, is what we found.
Oh, wow.
So there's the one minigame called Intrigue and Muster, which takes about 3 minutes. And then, for example, the Sword to Sword one, or the Reunion minigame, which then leads to a second minigame, takes a lot longer. Each person had about 3 turns, I believe. So that would be 15 mini-games, but the length of them were really disparate.
Did the game give you guidance about how long those might take, or did you just have to find that out and play?
You really have to find out in play. And again, it depends on the pace at which you go through them. You have the opportunity to linger a little bit in some of them. Other ones sort of like be like, no, this is what you're doing. Go through these questions. Right, move on. So it would depend on the players as well. And that's another reason why I think 5 is too many, because then if you're a person who's like, right, my game was 3 minutes, move on to the next person's turn, and you're like, okay, could be 45 minutes till I do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So are most of the scenes one person, 2 people, everyone?
Theoretically, you could have differing numbers, but the majority of the ones that we played out were 2 people. Sometimes 3. I didn't think any of them got bigger than that.
So did it feel like an RPG party game? Whatever that.
What does that even mean?
Well,
I think of how to host a murder when you say that, so...
Yeah, it did in the sense that you didn't need any prep or investment. You just started and you just went. And that's cool. Like, that's the thing about party games or like light games that people often say, is that you just sit down and you start playing, and that's why people like them. Doesn't matter what you've done beforehand, you can just go. So in that sense, it did. It didn't in the sense that you're still trying to tell a story that you're invested in. And so that's always going to make it a bit less like lighthearted and a bit more focused, I think.
that's really cool.
Anything else you want to say about that?
Nope. I think I pretty much covered everything I had to say.
Fair enough. So I'm going to be pretty quick about mine, because mine is more of a weird observation that I'm trying to maybe figure out what I think about it. So in March, I was sick for a little bit, so we got some things cut out of there, but I ran Trail of Cthulhu and 13th Age. We played Bat Hack. And then on the Gauntlet, I ran Hearts of Berlin and Legacy Left Among the Ruins. And then I did the last month of a 3-month series of Masks New Generation, because I've been doing these quarterly games, and someone had asked me to do Masks in the longer format. We've talked about Masks quite a bit on the podcast. Because of the open table, it meant that it was a very variable cast. And so we had one character that was there for all 13th sessions. We had another character that was there for the last 8. We had one where the character was in the first month and was a doomed, so we kind of accelerated the doom track for them. And then they came back in the 3rd session with a character that was a reflection on that original character. And then everybody else was essentially in for 3 or 4 weeks. It meant that rather than being like one full campaign, that it was like 3-4 issue miniseries, each with their own kind of arc and tone. And this is the first time I've run Masks more than a 3 or 4 shot. And it was really, really interesting. One of the things was that whenever I've played Masks, people go, here are my points, here are my goals to hit, these are my arcs, here's my headcanon, I'm going to get that out on the table. We're going to push for that. And you ended up with some of the characters who knew they were there for a longer time, like taking their time with that, and others like really pushing on it, which created sort of very different speeds that were happening. And it meant that the characters and players who were going to be there for longer made the safer choices when things came up, and maybe didn't push forward on moments that would change their character, that would evolve their character, because there's a lot of those in Masks. They kind of hesitated away from that. And then from my side of things, I will admit that if I had 2 characters and I knew one of them was going to be back for a bunch more sessions, I tended to focus in on the character who had the shorter term arc. And I think it may have done a disservice to a couple of the characters where I should have been thinking about giving them as much focus. And a couple of takeaways I have from it. It was a great game just because it was really fun to reincorporate and build with a superhero world with a lot of emotional impacts and try and bring things back. And because it wasn't necessarily the same players to reincorporate and explain them and put them in different contexts. It seems to me that some of the playbooks and Masks are built for the long arc. They have a lot of things and they go, we're going to do this, we're going to have to draw this out, we're going to take multiple steps and multiple stages to kind of get and draw out everything that's in this playbook, get it out on the table. Whereas others, boom, their stuff's on the table fast. I can't remember the name of it, but the character that's time displaced from the past and comes forward and their future self is evil. That character has a lot of things that you hit right away. Like boom, there are things that are happening with that character all the time. Whereas I think other characters aren't as strongly into that. And then the other thing I mentioned that was a weird thing, I'm still trying to figure this all out, still thinking about it, is I had one player who, because this game is part of Rich Rogers' sort of Gauntlet Comics initiative, where it's sort of a shared universe, they actually brought their character from another Masks game in. And so they came in with a very definitive sense of their character, but my setup and background for the world was a little bit different. And so it was almost like seeing a comic book character being written by a different writer. Like, okay, well, my world is heroic and, glossy, and now suddenly I'm in this sort of grim and gritty world, and I don't know how my character is supposed to react. And so that was really interesting. I think Masks, in the short term, you don't see all of the bells and whistles that it does have in that longer term, and I don't think I realized quite how much was going on in those playbooks until I ran it in the longer form. Sherry, comments, thoughts?
It was just that comment that you made that implied that your campaign was the dark and gritty one, which is not my experience with you.
It got pretty dark in some places there. Part of the problem was at the very start of the game, everybody had characters based around time travel or connected to that. So then I had to have time travel through the whole series. And time travel for me is always dark and unpleasant. So.
Yes, that makes sense then. I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Haley, V, have you played Masks?
Yeah. Actually, it's funny you mentioned the thing about the different writers. So when I ran Masks with one of my friends and we co-GM'd. We took turns GMing so that we were also able to play. Mm-hmm. So one week I'd do it and then the other week they'd do it and then we'd kind of like switch around. And it had a similar sort of thing that you were saying that depending on who was leading the charge, it had a kind of different tone and different focus. But it kind of sometimes worked because it did feel like comic books to do that. It felt like part of the genre, I guess.
Were you the grim and gritty? Or was the other GM the grim?
I think they're both pretty silly. I think there was different. It was just the level of smooching and high school.
Yeah, that's the other thing is having the weird split arcs like that. It did mean I had some recurring NPCs, but they didn't get as much depth as maybe they would have if it felt like more continuous throughout. Mm. Haley, thoughts, questions?
Yeah, no, I was also in that game of revolving GMs, and I also was one of the revolving GMs. So I can sympathize with that idea of like having a different cast of characters to try and bring in narratively every session. I think that's quite a heroic effort in itself. But I think that Masks is very impressive at how much, like you said, narrative punch it builds into each of those playbooks.
Well, that's all I kind of have to say about that. And so what I'd like to do is move on to our second segment, the one I'm even more excited about because I just saw the Kickstarter post mention that you put out today for some of this. And then Rich told us about something about the sports anime. So I want to hear about your project. So we're going to move to our guest segment.
Yeah.
Hi listeners, I want to tell you about the Gauntlet Patreon. The Gauntlet is one of the most active, vibrant communities in tabletop role-playing games. We produce podcasts, the Codex Zine, Gauntlet Hangouts, Gauntlet Con, and more. If you love small press, independent tabletop role-playing games, the Gauntlet is for you. And you can help keep things going by pledging to our Patreon. This year we have 4 different pledge levels for you to join at, each of which comes with a number of benefits. At the $2 level, you get early access to our actual play podcasts, including Pocket Size Play, as well as a special Keeper of the Gauntlet title. At the $5 level, you also get a PDF of our monthly zine, Codex. Your name and Keeper of the Gauntlet title is listed in the back of each issue of Codex while your pledge is active. At the $6 level, you also get access to the Gauntlet Slack group, which is the heart of our community. And at the $8 level, you get early RSVP access to new game events on Gauntlet Hangouts. The $8 spots are limited based off how many early access players we think the Gauntlet Hangouts calendar can support. Every month on the 15th, we will make a small number of new $8 spots available. So if you want to play games with the Gauntlet, make sure you keep an eye on our Patreon page around that time so you can grab one of those rare spots. Finally, every member of the Gauntlet Patreon, no matter the level they pledge at, gets to attend GauntletCon each year for free. GauntletCon is our incredible online gaming convention with over 200 game events and panels, competitions and prizes, and our bumpin' GauntletCon Discord server. Folks, we can't do all this awesome stuff without you, so go check out our page and please consider pledging. We're at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks.
So, V, Haley, what do you want to tell us? Tell us what's going on.
Let me introduce you to a few things we're working on. The all-consuming thing in our life at the moment is working on the Good Society expansion Kickstarter. That's been so much fun to sort of be involved in and to see grow and to throw in all of these great ideas and try to make something of it. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about Sports Anime RPG, which we were playtesting, as we mentioned, and that we're hoping to develop for down the road a bit more. So Haley, do you want to kick us off with the Good Society expansion, as that is the very first thing that comes out of your mouth every single morning?
Hey, I feel so called out. Yes, so in, 3 weeks, 1 day, and some number of hours, 12 hours, we are launching a Kickstarter for 2 new expansions for Good Society, which we're going to put in one book with 2 existing expansions, which are a magic expansion and a sort of like Masked Identities, Zorro-style swordsmanship expansion.
Oh, wow.
And I'm really excited about these 2 new expansions. They've been brewing in the back of my mind for quite a while. The first one is a upstairs-downstairs expansion where we really get to focus in on the staff and see their perspective and the dramas they face. And we've had a lot of requests for this expansion. I'm a massive Downton Abbey fan as well, so I was like, yes, I'm all about this. I'm really excited about that one. And probably the thing I'm most excited about is that the game is really made to tell 2 parallel stories that sort of like intersect and interweave at points and then separate. And I think that's going to be a fun, interesting structural challenge as well. So I'm looking forward to playtesting that a bit later this year. And the second one is called Emma Forget Me Not. And it is about telling sort of sprawling stories about the rise and fall of careers and fortunes, but also like long-term relationships and you know that trope of like, I loved you when I met you 20 years ago, then I went to a war and then I moved country and then you got married and now your husband's dead and like we reconnected, like that kind of, and we still love each other as much as we did 20 years ago, that kind of trope. I love those kind of stories as well. I'm a real sucker for those kind of stories. So I'm also very excited about that one. He's just laughing at me. She knows my degree of enthusiasm.
Yeah, of course. You have to be enthusiastic about these things. I think they're really fun, different ways as well to play Good Society. But I will say this about the expansions is that they are like expansions in the board game sense almost, where there's going to be additional rules, so make sure you know the base game before you dive right in. But I think that makes it interesting.
Yeah, one thing that we decided to do was to make all of them compatible. So that you can play a magical fae family that lingers on this world for generations telling sprawling stories, or you could be a servant by day who is a vigilante by night. So I'm kind of looking forward to that aspect of it as well.
Yeah. Those are like kinks. That's I think that's going to be really, really fun. And I'm super committed to making it really excellent. But I'm sure that it's going to be like, yeah, this is good. Then we go into wider playtesting and we're like, yeah, all right, lots more to work on. And then there's that iteration to make that smooth will be so delicious icing on the game designing cake.
Project management speaking right there.
Oh, so good.
But V, do you want to talk about Fight with Spirit?
Yeah, so Fight with Spirit, it's a collaborative role-playing game. It's about a high school sports team growing up together and like fighting for what they're passionate about, the realm of sports. Really, the things that you're going to be doing in this game is like having rivalries, honing your skills, and like striving to take your school into the next level of the championship and just growing up. and learning about friendship and like your own feelings and who you are. And so those are really the two spheres that we want to hit with this experience very strongly.
Now, is it any sports, or do you have things focused for the different kinds?
Yeah, so it's open sports. You can pick whatever sort of sport you want to focus on. But I would say that there's probably a different set of things you should be thinking about for one sport versus another, depending on how like that sport is formatted. So right now, we're focusing down on like sort of the 2 or 3 like main types, like team versus team. And once we sort of have more time to work on it, we really want to like flesh out all of the different other formulations of sports that you might do. I guess you can categorize sports on a broader level.
And I'll add to that, it doesn't have to be a real sport. We've played this game with a completely made-up sport, and it worked very well.
Yeah.
It was very fun.
So we can do the anime Hogwarts Quidditch?
Yeah!
Absolutely.
Okay.
That sounds like a great suggestion.
What is the base system? Is it PBTA? Is it something else? What are you working with?
It's a card game system, and it's sort of it's an original system based around questions for your character that are like milestone in their development. And as you go through the game, you'll be answering these questions. Whether am I good enough might be a question, or is this the right place for me to be, etc. So each of those questions are segmented, and you sort of fill them out until you answer them one way or another. Of course, asterisks, these things might change. They're just the current build.
Right.
But we know that it's going to be focused around these questions, because that's a lot of what we're doing when we're growing up, is interrogating ourselves and the world around us. I think it makes sense for a game that's centered around that growing up process to have a sort of similar core heart.
And are the games the competitions themselves, are they another phase of the game, or is there another system? How does that work at this point?
Yeah, they are. Yes, that's exactly right. So the game is sort of roughly divided up into 2 phases. The bit where you bond with your teammates and train and have high school drama, and then there's the match phase where you have showdowns with the other teams. And the match phase is based on card drawing from a match deck. And so you draw cards that could be headway cards, which are good for your team, or setback cards, and the cards have questions on them, and you choose a question to resolve. And then there's sort of currently, there is a sort of a resolution process for the question. It's about how you tell the story of resolving that question. So we might hear a character's inner thoughts, we might see a slow-mo, we might get a cool action shot. That's how the matches play out.
Neat. Sherry?
Yeah, I'm wondering, do you have you have the themes of growing up? Are there any other themes that you're weaving in there with your questions? Or is that like a sort of way that you would flavor the games up with sports?
There are sort of thematic parts that we're building into each archetype. It's sort of like similar to what we did in Alas, where a character is made up of 4 small, and I guess Good Society. Maybe it's just a thing we do. The characters are made up of, several parts of who they are, whether that's their archetype and the relationships they have. And each of those little parts have questions attached to them that are all sort of thematically linked. If you're picking like the prodigy, you're going to be exploring those sorts of questions. Sort of like Masks also does similar things with their playbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Those are a ripe area to explore different themes. But I would say that at its core, it really is about like cohesion, team building, and growing up. Bonding with yourself and others around you.
I think one of the other themes of the game, which is related to growing up, is like an idea that comes from sports anime, which is the last summer idea. Like, you've only got 3 years in the high school division, and when that time ends, you're not going to be able to play sport anymore, but you're also not going to be able to be in the relationships that you're in anymore. Your world is going to fracture and tear apart. Ugh. Sport as a metaphor for that being about to happen, and what you do knowing that is impending, is an interesting theme as well, actually.
So I have to ask you now, Sherry, because we were talking about doing this interview, and so we've been watching Kokoro, one of the basketball sports animes. We just started that one. What are the touchstones for you in terms of sports animes or manga, and that are probably the most inspirational?
Well, my favorite sports anime, which is a little bit alternative. It's a little bit different to many sports anime. Is called Jahaya Furu. It's actually about karuta, which is this Japanese sport of matching poetry cards.
Yes.
But it is really a beautiful anime in the way it tells stories. It's like my ideal. If we could capture some of its essence in our game, I would be so happy. The characters are very compelling and the story arc is very interesting. But there's also cool sports battles. So I think it's great. V, what's your pick?
That's unfair because I introduced that to you. It's actually very funny because Chihaya Furu has been in hiatus for a long time, but this year the 3rd season is finally coming out, and Haley's just watched it this year for the first time. So it's like, oh yeah, I'm waiting a year. I've been waiting 6 years for this.
Oh no.
But it's yeah, so that's great. There's also a Haikyuu, which is the volleyball one, which is very, very popular, and I quite enjoy the silliness in that as well. That has a much more comedic, but still epic, tone to it.
Awesome. Anything else you want to say about that?
No, but I will note how hilarious it is that Haley and I keep saying currently, because we change things all the time.
Okay. All right, we're going to move to our next segment, Give Me Life. So listeners, we're going to now have our guests tell us about something that is giving them life. So Sherry, tell me, what is giving you life right now?
So there's a weird thing where I have had a very happy and spoiled life of being a gamer, playing lots of games all the time and consistently. But I've hit this kind of strange, weird place where it isn't just playing games. I'm around people who are doing all kinds of play testing and hacking, and I love these people and I love these games that they're doing, and it's so exciting to work with them when they're working on those things. And now I'm hacking a thing and get help with some setting development, of all things setting. Okay, that's not usually my thing, but I'm super excited about it, and I'm sort of stunned of being there doing this thing. Just seems so a sea change from where I was a year ago in a lot of ways. And it's all because of people, really awesome people that just make me want to be with them and help them and do those things and somehow contribute to that awesomeness.
That's really cool.
V, what is giving you life right now?
Yeah, talking about sports, really sports things in my life. I'm filling my life with so many sports. I'm really into bouldering, which, if you don't know, is rock climbing a short wall without any equipment. And it's currently the professional bouldering season, so there's so many cool tournaments to watch, and it's so inspiring, and it's making me want to climb all the time. It's really cool. And we do climb pretty regularly, so it's been really, really giving me life doing all this sports stuff. Also getting into powerlifting, so all very fun.
Awesome.
Neat.
Haley, what about you?
We just recently came back from a trip to Port Macquarie, which is a beautiful little coastal area in New South Wales. And they have there a lot of what is called littoral rainforest, which is rainforest that is within 2 kilometers of an ocean. If you like rainforests and you like coastlines and you're like, hey, why can't I get both at the same time? It's the place for you. And it is so amazingly beautiful there, and I just love soaking in that environment and that atmosphere. It's very, very rejuvenating, so I had an awesome time.
Awesome.
Cool.
My pick is incredibly mundane, but there's a new video game called Nelki and the Alchemist of the New World, and it is in the Atelier series of alchemy RPGs, but this one is not that. It is a crossover game. I love these where they bring all the characters from all the series together in a weird cross-dimensional thing, and it's a city builder game where you get all of the alchemists and then all of their friends come, and you have to build a city of shops and ateliers and all this stuff. Sherry's the one who's played all the earlier Atelier games. I've always been like, oh, that looks like work. But I bought this for her, and I have not stopped playing it. And I have a notebook filled with, okay, this is what I need to do here. This is how much I need of this. This is how much I need of this. And It's crazy.
I am vindicated.
Yes. Listeners, that's our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We also have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And we have a Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. You can go there to support the show. We have multiple levels of Patreon support, which includes access to our zine. It supports the various podcasts that we do besides this one. Of course, I have a weekly blog with lots of articles and things. So we're doing all kinds of cool stuff. If you're not interested in that, then perhaps you might consider rating or reviewing us on your podcast app of choice, because that's a cool thing to do. I'm just going to say that right now. Thank you, Sherry, for co-hosting here.
Thank you. It was a joy and a pleasure.
Thank you, V, for coming on and telling us about these projects.
It's a pleasure being here with you, folks.
And Haley, thank you very much.
Yes, lovely to chat.
And listeners, that's our show.